16th century Peru was living through a time of intense transformations, marked by the clash between two cultures, the Incan tradition and Spanish rule. Lima, founded in 1535 by Francisco Pizarro, quickly became one of the most important centers of the viceroyalty of Peru, where European settlers, subjugated indigenous people, and enslaved Africans lived side by side. The city grew amid contrasts. On the one hand, churches, convents and monasteries were erected with splendor to consolidate the Catholic faith brought by missionaries. On the other, poverty, inequality, and social marginalization increased. It was in this environment of social tensions and religious fervor that Isabel Flores de Oliva was born, the future Saint Rose of Lima, destined to become the first canonized saint of the Americas. Isabel was born on April 20, 1586, in Lima, the daughter of Gaspar Flores, a Spanish soldier, and María de Oliva, a woman of mixed ancestry. From a young age, the girl was called Rosa because of her extraordinary beauty. It is said that an indigenous servant, upon seeing her in the cradle, exclaimed that she looked like a rose because of the delicacy of her face. The nickname quickly spread among family and neighbors, and the child herself came to be known that way. Later, this designation would become a providential sign, for Rose would be a symbol of the spiritual beauty that blossoms amid life's difficulties. From childhood, Rose showed a singular temperament. While other children liked to play or distract themselves with common activities, she inclined towards silent prayer and recollection. Her parents were surprised to see her pray for long periods before a small image of Our Lady, improvising simple altars with flowers and fabrics. These attitudes were not common for a child of her age and soon became signs of a special vocation. At the same time, Rose showed a deep sensitivity toward the suffering of others, which would later mark her life of charity. However, the girl's path was not easy. Her family was not wealthy, they lived with financial difficulties and depended on constant work to support the many children. Rose helped her mother care for the house and tend the garden, from which they took food and flowers to sell. From an early age, she learned the value of simplicity and humility, understanding that true wealth did not lie in luxury or power, but in the capacity to offer one's life to God and to one's neighbor. Poverty, which could have been a cause for revolt or sadness, became for her a fertile ground for holiness. Rose's beauty drew everyone's attention and at the same time became a burden. Many neighbors and even relatives commented on her physical grace, and soon suitors began to appear for marriage. However, Rose had decided in her heart that she would belong only to Christ, living in consecrated virginity. To ward off gazes and proposals, she took radical measures. She hid her face with veils and even rubbed pepper on her lips so they would lose the reddish color so many admired. Her desire was that beauty would not be an occasion for vanity or spiritual distraction, but an instrument of mortification and total surrender to God. This spirit of penance was not just an isolated gesture, but the fruit of a deep awareness of the spiritual dimension of life. From childhood, Rose understood that the true struggle was not against people, but against temptations and deviations that draw human beings away from God. Inspired by the life of St. Catherine of Siena, to whom she had great devotion, she decided to imitate her penances, fasting, disciplining herself, and dedicating herself to prolonged prayers. All this was not done out of pride, but with humility and love, desiring to unite herself to the suffering of Christ for the salvation of souls. Her parents, at many moments, did not understand this vocation. They dreamed of a good marriage for their daughter that could improve the family's economic condition, but Rose, convinced of her choice, resisted all pressures. This family tension was one of the first crosses she had to carry, facing the incomprehension of those she loved most. Even so, her obedience and respect for her parents were never abandoned. Even while disagreeing with their plans, she served them with dedication, took care of domestic tasks, and worked tirelessly to help support the household. In addition to a life of prayer and penance, Rose nurtured a deep love for the poor and the sick. From a young age, she had the habit of setting aside part of the food from her own meal to share with those who knocked at the door asking for help. Sometimes her mother reproached her for this gesture, concerned about the family's scarcity, but Rose calmly replied that charity never impoverishes and that Christ would multiply the goods of those who know how to share. This spirit of service would grow over the years and make her a true consoler of the needy. In the garden of her house, Rose began to build a small hermitage where she withdrew in prayer and penance. At just 10 years old, she spent hours in this space, meditating on the passion of Christ and offering silent sacrifices. This retreat, so simple and improvised, became a true inner monastery where the girl prepared for a life of holiness. It was there that she experienced the presence of God in a profound way, feeling in her heart a mystical union that gave her strength to face daily difficulties. Colonial Peru, marked by the luxuries and parties of the Spanish elite, saw in Rose an impressive contrast. While many sought wealth and status, she chose voluntary poverty and renunciation of the world. This difference made her misunderstood by some, admired by others, and the target of comments that spread throughout the city. For some, it was a matter of exaggeration or fanaticism. For others, an evident sign of sanctity. Rose, however, did not care about outside opinions. Her only desire was to live for Christ. Even while still very young, Rose already attracted the attention of the Dominican religious, who perceived in her clear signs of a vocation. The example of Saint Catherine of Siena, also a Dominican tertiary, served as a guide for her life. Later, Rose would enter the Third Order of Saint Dominic, living her consecration in the world without withdrawing to a convent. But already in childhood, her affinity with the Dominican charism was revealed in the intensity of her prayer, in her love for penance, and in the doctrinal firmness she manifested in her conversations. Another striking aspect of her childhood was her devotion to Our Lady. Rose approached the Virgin as a trusting daughter, asking her for help to remain firm in her vocation. She prayed long rosaries, offered flowers at small altars, and imitated the example of humility and obedience of the Mother of God. This filial relationship with Mary was a constant in her life and would also be one of the pillars of her mature spirituality. For Rose, to love the Virgin meant to follow in the footsteps of Christ with fidelity. In Rose's childhood and adolescence, therefore, the clear signs of an extraordinary life were already present. Her surrender to God, her struggle against the vanities of the world, her compassion for the poor, and her constant pursuit of penance were not merely isolated acts, but the preparation for a great mission. What began as small gestures in the silence of the home and the family garden would become a path of holiness recognized by the entire church. Rose, the simple girl from Lima, was already being shaped by grace to become the first flower of the Americas offered to Christ. Rose's adolescence was marked by a profound inner struggle between the natural desires of youth and the irresistible call of Christ. While other young women her age dreamed of parties, adornments, and possible marriages, Rose chose silence, prayer, and sacrifice. This choice of life caused strangeness in many, but it was the fruit of a mature decision that had burned in her heart since childhood, to belong entirely to God. This absolute love for Christ led her to pursue practices of penance that, to the world's eyes, seemed incomprehensible, but for her were ways of participating in Jesus' redemptive suffering. One of her most radical actions was to consecrate her virginity to God in secret while still young. This promise, made in prayer, was a pact of love that definitively sealed her spiritual life. From then on, Rose not only resisted the suitors who sought her out, but began to mortify herself so as not to be seen as beautiful in the eyes of the world. She tended the garden, wove flower crowns for altars, but for herself she chose the rigors of simplicity, avoiding vanities and adornments. Her greatest desire was that her soul be more beautiful than any outward appearance. Penance held a central place in her routine. Rose fashioned a metal crown studded with nails that she wore discreetly under her veil, in imitation of Christ's crown of thorns. In addition, she slept on hard boards or on stones, denying herself the comfort of a soft bed. Many times she fasted on bread and water, offering each privation for the conversion of sinners and the salvation of souls. These gestures were not the fruits of disorderly exaggeration, but of a deep spirituality moved by a passionate love for the crucified Jesus. Her family, upon noticing these attitudes, worried about her health and her future. Her mother, in particular, did not understand how a young woman so beautiful and full of life could waste her youth in sacrifices and renunciations. Nevertheless, Rose, with tenderness and patience, explained that there was no greater joy than to give oneself entirely to the Lord. Even though she was a source of tensions within the home, Rose never lacked filial respect and obedience, which revealed her spiritual maturity and her desire to unite the divine vocation with human duty. Gradually, Rose acquired a reputation for holiness in Lima. Many neighbors and acquaintances noticed her disciplined life and spirit of prayer. Some people began to seek her out to ask for advice or intercession in times of difficulty. Still young, Rose was already becoming a spiritual point of reference for the community, even without holding an office or official function in the church. This leadership was not the fruit of vanity, but of the grace of God that manifested itself in her in an evident way. Her discreet and hidden life, paradoxically, began to illuminate the city. Another striking trait of her youth was her dedication to work. So as not to be a burden on the family, Rose devoted herself to embroidery and sewing, the proceeds of which helped support the household. She also cultivated flowers, which were sold in the local market. While she sewed or worked in the garden, she kept her spirit in prayer, transforming daily tasks into a true sacrifice of praise. This balance between contemplation and action was a sign that her holiness was not restricted to recollection, but also encompassed practical life. Amid these experiences, Rose matured spiritually and discovered her affinity with Dominican spirituality. Inspired by the example of Saint Catherine of Siena, she wished to follow in the footsteps of the order of preachers, but without leaving the world for enclosure. She therefore became a member of the Third Order of Saint Dominic, consecrating herself as a Dominican laywoman. This choice consolidated her vocation, to live in the heart of the world, but with her soul turned toward heaven, being a visible sign of God's presence among men. Her life of prayer reached an impressive level of intimacy. Rose spent hours before the Blessed Sacrament, and when she could not be in church, she withdrew to her small hermitage in the backyard. There, she meditated at length on the Passion of Christ and experienced mystical ecstasies. It was common that in her prayers she had visions of Jesus and of the Virgin Mary, who consoled her and strengthened her in her mission. This mystical union, however, did not withdraw her from reality. On the contrary, it made her even more dedicated to the poor and the sick. The decision to remain a virgin and consecrated to Christ required profound renunciations. Many still insisted that she should marry, and some even mocked her choice, calling her exaggerated. Rose, however, was never shaken by criticism or misunderstanding. For her, fidelity to Christ was superior to any human recognition. This firmness amid social pressures is one of the greatest proofs of her inner strength and her trust in divine providence. Her life was a silent preaching against superficiality and the pursuit of transient pleasures. Rose also developed a strong spirituality of reparation. She felt in her heart the desire to offer herself as a victim for sinners, interceding that God would have mercy on those who had strayed from His grace. This radical surrender caused many to associate her with the spirit of the Church's great mystics, such as Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila. The difference is that Rose, living in the Americas, became a sign that holiness was not limited to Europe, but blossomed also in the New World. The example of the young woman soon began to inspire other young women in Lima, who began to imitate her in her practices of prayer and charity. Even without founding a congregation or assuming formal leadership roles, Rose became a model of Christian life, attracting people from different social classes. This witness, lived in silence and humility, showed that the true strength of the Church does not lie in riches or honors, but in the hidden holiness of her children. Rose, even without wanting to, was already a missionary within her own city, with her youth marked by penances, consecration, and a profound life of prayer. Rose of Lima was laying the foundations of her holiness. Her life, far from being a burden, was experienced as a source of spiritual joy. Even though her body suffered from fasts and sacrifices, her soul overflowed with peace and hope. She understood that love for Christ demands radicality, and therefore she did not hesitate to offer herself entirely. This youthful surrender prepared the ground for the miracles, graces, and fruits that would spring from her adult life. Rose of Lima's spiritual maturity did not isolate her from the world, but made her even closer to those in need. Her heart, inflamed with love for Christ, saw in every poor and sick person the living image of the Lord Himself. In her home's backyard, she built a small space that functioned as a kind of improvised infirmary, where she welcomed the sick abandoned by society. There, she herself tended wounds, washed debilitated bodies, and offered words of comfort. Many times, she faced resistance from her family, who feared contagious diseases, but Rose was not intimidated. For her, to serve the poor was to serve Christ directly. Rose's care was not limited to the body alone. She had an extraordinary capacity to console spiritually those who suffered. Distressed people, tormented by family problems or by their sins, turned to her in search of counsel and prayer. Even without academic training or advanced theological studies, Rose spoke with inspired wisdom that deeply touched hearts. Many left her conversations transformed, convinced that God was calling them to a new life. It was as if the grace of the Holy Spirit spoke through her. One hallmark of her charity was the humility with which she performed each gesture. Rose did not consider herself superior to anyone, much less believe she was doing great things. On the contrary, she saw herself as a small servant, chosen by God to love others in silence. This humility attracted people even more, who felt welcomed and valued in her presence. Her charity did not humiliate but elevated. It was not limited to giving things, but offered her very heart. This is the difference between ordinary philanthropy and true Christian charity. The city of Lima at that time suffered from great social inequalities. While wealthy colonists enjoyed parties and banquets, many indigenous people and enslaved Africans lived in inhuman conditions. Rose did not remain silent in the face of this reality. She prayed intensely for justice and reparation and did what was within her reach to alleviate suffering. She distributed food, sewed clothes, and devoted time to listening to the most marginalized. Her love made no distinction of race, origin, or social position. All were children of God, worthy of dignity and compassion. Testimonies from the time report that Rose would spend entire nights caring for gravely ill people, changing dressings, and offering water to the thirsty. Even exhausted, she never complained. On the contrary, She found joy in sacrificing herself for others, as if each gesture were an opportunity to unite herself even more to the cross of Christ. This extreme dedication led her to be compared to Saint Elizabeth of Hungary and other saints known for their service to the poor. What was annoying or repulsive to many was for her a privilege. Another impressive aspect of her life of charity was her ability to transform her own home into a place of welcome. Her mother, initially resistant, eventually accepted that Rose would use part of the home to care for those in need. Thus, the residence of the Flores de Oliva family became a true house of mercy in the heart of Lima. This attitude showed that holiness is not limited to churches or convents, but can blossom in everyday life, in small homes when there is true love. Rose showed that charity is possible in any circumstance. In addition to caring materially for the poor, Rose interceded for them in constant prayer. She spent long hours before the Blessed Sacrament, offering every supplication for those who suffered. For her, service and prayer were inseparable. It was not enough to heal the body, it was also necessary to save the soul. This integral vision of the human person made her apostolate something complete, uniting action and contemplation. For this reason, many said that she not only helped the poor, but evangelized them with her very life. The fame of her charity began to spread throughout Lima, and over time, even to other regions of the Viceroyalty. People of different backgrounds came to seek her, some in search of material help, others in search of spiritual direction. Even important figures of colonial society respected her and recognized her holiness. The contrast was evident. A simple young woman without political power or riches became a reference for an entire city purely through the silent witness of love. This paradox is one of the greatest proofs that true authority comes from holiness. Rose did not limit her action to those who knocked at her door. When she heard of someone in need, she did not hesitate to go there, even if it was far or dangerous. Many times she walked through the streets of Lima carrying food, hidden in her tunic so as not to be seen. She preferred to act anonymously, without seeking human recognition. Her joy lay in knowing that Christ was served in the least ones. This missionary disposition, even within the city, revealed Rose's apostolic ardor, who desired that everyone experience God's love. Caring for the sick became for Rose a school of patience and compassion. Many times she dealt with aggressive or ungrateful people who rejected her help. Even so, she continued to serve them with meekness, remembering that Christ too was rejected and humiliated. This fidelity in loving even when there was no human return was a sign of a supernatural charity that went beyond the logic of interest or exchange. Rose loved simply because she saw Christ in every human being. The missionary dimension of her life of charity also extended to prayer for the missionaries who were evangelizing in other regions of the Americas. Rose was aware that the continent was in the process of evangelization and that many peoples still did not know Christ. Therefore, she offered sacrifices and prayers so that missionaries would be strengthened in their mission and that indigenous peoples would receive the gospel with openness of heart. In this way, her hidden life in Lima was united to the great universal mission of the Church. By uniting intense prayer with concrete service, Rose of Lima became a living example of the gospel. Her life of charity was not merely a set of good works, but a true self-gift out of love. Every poor person served, every sick person cared for, and every word of consolation were expressions of her union with the crucified Christ. This silent and total surrender would later make her not only Patroness of Peru, but Patroness of all Latin America and the Philippines, a symbol that holiness blossoms where there is true love. As her spiritual life deepened, Rose of Lima began to experience extraordinary mystical phenomena that drew the attention of all around her. Her moments of prayer were often accompanied by ecstasies so intense that she seemed to disconnect completely from the world. Witnesses report that on various occasions, Rose remained motionless for long periods, with a serene and radiant face, as if she were directly contemplating the divine mystery. These states were not the product of delirium, but clear signs of God's supernatural action in her soul. One of the most striking aspects of these ecstasies was the frequency with which Rose had visions of Christ. In her mystical experiences, she saw herself before Jesus, who consoled her and strengthened her amid trials. Many times, she felt the weight of the cross in her own body, as if she were participating in the Lord's passion in a real and concrete way. This deep identification with Christ's suffering did not leave her shaken. On the contrary, it filled her heart with a joy incomprehensible to those who did not share the same faith. Besides visions of Christ, Rose also experienced mystical encounters with the Virgin Mary. She approached the Mother of God as a trusting daughter, asking her for strength to persevere in her vocation. In some ecstasies, Our Lady appeared to encourage her, reminding her that holiness requires courage and total surrender. These Marian experiences reinforced in Rose the purity, humility, and maternal love that would characterize her entire life. Mary was for her not only a model, but a real presence who accompanied her on the path of holiness. These extraordinary phenomena drew the attention of many, but Rose never sought to display them or boast of them. On the contrary, she tried to hide them so as not to be the target of comments or praise. When she noticed that someone perceived her state of ecstasy, she felt ashamed, fearing that she would be taken as proud or a fraud. This humility impressed even more, for it revealed that her mystical life was not the fruit of vanity, but of a true intimacy with God, lived in silence and simplicity. Many priests and religious who accompanied her spiritually became convinced that her experiences were authentic and came from divine grace. They were not illusions or exaggerations, but a special gift granted by God to strengthen her mission. These confirmations were important, for they prevented Rose from falling into doubts or discouragement in the face of the criticisms of some who distrusted her holiness. The Church, with prudence, always accompanied her life, recognizing in it a genuine supernatural action. During these ecstasies, Rose received messages from Christ that called her to an ever more radical surrender. One of the most well-known phrases attributed to her is, "Lord, increase my sufferings, provided that you also increase my love for you." This supplication reveals Rose's heart. She did not seek to be freed from pain, but to transform it into an expression of love for God. This desire to suffer for Christ impressed everyone, for it contrasted with human logic, which flees suffering at any cost. For Rose, suffering was a path of purification and union with the Lord. Another characteristic of her mystical experiences was the gift of spiritual discernment. Many people came to her asking for prayer, and Rose, in some cases, seemed to know the most intimate intentions of each heart. It was not a matter of fortune-telling, but of a grace granted by the Holy Spirit that allowed her to guide with precision and wisdom. This spiritual sensitivity further reinforced her reputation as a woman of God, capable of leading others on the path of conversion and holiness. The ecstasies were also accompanied at certain moments by physical manifestations. Accounts indicate that on some occasions Rose showed signs similar to the stigmata, such as intense pains in her hands and feet, although they did not leave permanent visible marks. These sufferings were for her occasions to offer herself in union with Christ's sacrifice. She never sought to display them or speak about them, but endured them in silence, offering them for the salvation of souls and the strengthening of the Church. Her mystical life, far from drawing her away from the world, made her even more sensitive to the needs of the people around her. After each experience of ecstasy, Rose emerged strengthened and full of tenderness for the poor and the sick. It was as if contemplation became action, perfectly uniting the mystical dimension and the charitable dimension. This balance between deep prayer and concrete service is one of the greatest lessons of her life, showing that true mysticism is not an escape, but a commitment to love. Even in the face of such closeness to God, Rose never ceased to recognize her smallness. She used to say she was only a worm of the earth, an expression of humility that contrasted with the greatness of her spiritual experiences. This awareness of her human weakness prevented any pride and made her rely even more on divine grace. Her humility, together with her ardent love for Christ, made her a model of true holiness for all who knew her. It is important to highlight that, although the ecstasies were extraordinary, what truly sanctified Rose was her fidelity in everyday life. The mystical experiences were gratuitous gifts from God, but what made her holy was constancy in prayer, penance, and charity. This lesson is fundamental. Holiness is not found in extraordinary phenomena, but in fidelity to God's love in small things. Rose understood this deeply and never allowed the supernatural gifts to become more important than her daily self-offering. Thus, the mystical life of Rose of Lima became an impressive testimony of the intimate union between heaven and earth. Her visions, ecstasies, and extraordinary gifts were signs of God's presence in her life, but always accompanied by humility and concrete charity. Therefore, even centuries later, her experience continues to inspire not only mystics or religious, but also ordinary lay people who desire to live an authentic faith. In Rose, we see the reflection of Christ's promise. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Despite her evident holiness, the life of Rose of Lima was not marked only by consolations and mystical gifts. On the contrary, she faced much incomprehension, criticism, and even humiliations from people close to her and from Lima's society itself. Many saw in her penances senseless exaggerations, accusing her of fanaticism. Some relatives considered her practices an obstacle to the family's future, especially because Rose rejected advantageous marriages that could bring economic stability. This resistance generated tensions within the home, making her own house a place of constant trial. Financial difficulties were also a heavy cross in her life. The Flores de Oliva family never enjoyed wealth, and Rose, aware of this, strove to help with embroidery, sewing, and the cultivation of flowers. Yet at times, poverty pressed so hard that arguments arose at home. In these situations, Rose offered everything to God with patience, without ever rebelling. She knew that true wealth did not lie in money, but in absolute trust in divine providence. This unshakable faith kept her serene, even in the most difficult moments. Another painful aspect was the spiritual loneliness she often experienced. Although she had spiritual direction and the support of some Dominican religious, Rose was constantly misinterpreted. People said that her visions were illusions or even the work of the devil. For someone so sensitive, these accusations could have destroyed her soul. Nevertheless, Rose endured everything in silence, surrendering herself to God's judgment. This perseverance in the face of slander became one of the greatest proofs of her faith, demonstrating that her love for Christ was stronger than any human word. Rose's health was also severely tested. From a young age, she suffered from illnesses that left her debilitated. Her weakened body was further burdened by rigorous fasts and penances. However, she never complained or sought pity. On the contrary, she said that pain was a way to unite herself even more intimately to the crucified Christ. For her, every suffering was an opportunity to offer something to God for the conversion of sinners. This way of facing illness scandalized some, but deeply edified those who understood her spirit. Rose's trials were not only physical and spiritual, but also social. In a city marked by pride and the desire for status, her choice of voluntary poverty was seen as an affront. While other young women sought advantageous marriages and a comfortable life, Rose rejected all of that in the name of Christ. Many mocked her, calling her foolish, but Rose, firm in her decision, did not let herself be influenced by public opinion. Her courage to swim against the tide made her a model of Christian fortitude amid a worldly society. Despite so many difficulties, Rose never lost her inner joy. Her expression radiated peace even on the most painful days. This spiritual balance was the fruit of her deep union with God, who sustained her amid the storms. It was not a superficial joy, but a profound contentment that sprang from the certainty that she was doing the divine will. This peace attracted people who saw in her a reflection of Christ himself. Many approached just to contemplate her serenity, which was a silent witness to God's presence. Amid trials, Rose found support in some confessors and spiritual friends. The Dominicans, in particular, recognized in her a soul chosen by God. Although there was prudence in evaluating her mystical experiences, they perceived the authenticity of her life of prayer and penance. This spiritual guidance was fundamental so that Rose would not lose her way amid criticism and misunderstandings. Thus she remained firm, balancing the supernatural gifts with obedience to the Church, a sign of her true humility. Rose's life of trials also manifested itself in spiritual attacks. She reported that, on several occasions, she felt the presence of the evil one trying to disturb her. Voices, terrifying visions, and even physical phenomena sought to divert her from the path. However, she was not shaken. She made the sign of the cross, prayed the rosary, and trusted totally in the protection of Christ and the Virgin Mary. This resistance to spiritual evil is another impressive aspect of her journey, showing that her holiness was won amid intense battles against the forces of darkness. In her life, Rose also experienced long periods of spiritual aridity when she seemed not to feel God's presence. These dark nights were moments of great inner trial in which her faith was tested to the limit. Nevertheless, she remained faithful, continuing to pray and to trust even without consolations. This aspect brings her life even closer to that of many faithful, for it shows that holiness is not the absence of difficulties, but perseverance in the midst of the desert. Rose lived in practice what Saint Teresa of Avila said, "Patience obtains everything." Despite so many crosses, Rose never allowed suffering to extinguish her compassion for others. Even sick or tired, she continued to care for the poor and the sick. This capacity to forget herself and serve her neighbor is one of the most beautiful traits of her personality. She understood that the Christian life is not centered on the self, but on total surrender to God and to one's neighbor. Thus, her trials became a school of love and charity, rather than a cause for despair or bitterness. Rose knew that her life would not be understood by most, but she accepted this with serenity. She used to say that she wanted to be hidden in the heart of Christ, as one who does not seek human glory but only divine approval. This desire to disappear before the eyes of the world so that Christ would be exalted sums up her entire spirituality. She did not want to be recognized as a saint, but only to be faithful to God in every detail of her daily life. This humility made her all the greater. The trials of Rose of Lima reveal, therefore, that holiness is not the absence of difficulties, but the capacity to transform them into occasions for spiritual growth. Her family struggles, her illnesses, social misunderstandings and spiritual attacks were instruments that brought her even closer to Christ. Far from discouraging her, these crosses strengthened her in the faith and made her shine still more as an example for everyone. Her life is proof that when the soul surrenders itself entirely to God, no difficulty can destroy hope. In the last years of her life, Saint Rose of Lima experienced a progressive physical weakening that left her increasingly debilitated. The rigorous penances she had practiced since youth, together with recurrent illnesses, caused her health to be consumed rapidly. However, she did not see this process as a misfortune, but as part of her vocation to unite herself more intimately to the suffering Christ. For Rose, each pain was transformed into silent prayer and offered for the conversion of souls and for the Church, which at that time faced great challenges in the New World. Illness, far from taking her away from service, intensified her charity. Even sick, Rose did not stop welcoming the poor and the needy. She no longer had the strength to go out through the streets, but she transformed her home into a true hospital of souls where sufferers found spiritual comfort. Many times she attended to them even amid bouts of pain, offering them words of hope and fervent prayers. This spirit of self-giving to the very end revealed that her holiness was not merely the fruit of youth and energy, but of constant fidelity until her last moments of life. In this period, Rose also deepened even more her life of prayer and mysticism. The ecstasies became more frequent, and she reported visions of Christ and the Virgin Mary that consoled her in hours of suffering. These experiences, however, did not make her forget the reality around her. On the contrary, they strengthened her mission of intercession, leading her to pray with even greater intensity for the missionaries, for Christian families, and for peoples who still did not know the faith. Her hidden life in Lima, weakened by illness, reached universal horizons through prayer. Loneliness in this period was one of the heaviest crosses. Many still did not understand the radical nature of her self-giving and accused her of exaggerations or of causing her own illness through penances. Rose endured these criticisms with patience, aware that holiness is never fully recognized during life. She used to say that her mission was not to be understood, but to be faithful to Christ. This willingness to accept humiliations with serenity demonstrated the heroic degree of her virtues, confirming her spiritual greatness. In her final years, Rose came to live in the house of Gonzalo de la Maza, a royal official and friend of the family, whose wife also became a great supporter of her vocation. There, she found a little more tranquility to endure her illnesses, although she never ceased to mortify herself. Even debilitated, she made a point of maintaining her spiritual discipline, prolonged prayers, fasts, and mortifications offered with love. It was as if she was saying that, as long as she had life, she wanted to spend herself entirely for God and for her neighbor. The intensity of her union with Christ reached impressive levels. Witnesses report that in her moments of prayer, Rose would utter words that expressed a complete fusion with the heart of Jesus. She said, for example, "My Lord, increase my suffering, provided that you also increase my love for you." This supplication reveals the essence of her spirituality, not to fear pain, but to transform it into redemptive love. This attitude aroused admiration in some, but incomprehension in many, for it challenged human logic. The illness progressed to such a point that Rose became increasingly unable to perform simple tasks. For long periods, she remained bedridden, suffering from intense pain. Even so, she transformed her bed into an altar of sacrifice, where she offered each moment to God. Many times, she told those who visited her that she desired nothing other than to fulfill the Lord's will. This unconditional acceptance of the cross made her ever more like Christ, turning her life into a true interior martyrdom, silent and hidden. During these years of suffering, Rose also received extraordinary spiritual consolations. At times she reported feeling enveloped by a heavenly light and an indescribable peace, as if she were transported to heaven. These moments of grace were like balm amid pain, signs that God was sustaining her in her fidelity. It was not an escape from reality, but an anticipation of the glory reserved for her. Far from taking her away from life, these experiences made her even more serene and hopeful in the face of the nearness of death. Her last days were especially painful. The illness consumed her rapidly, leaving her extremely weak. Nevertheless, her soul remained strong, sustained by the hope of eternal life. Surrounded by friends and family, Rose radiated peace and confidence, as if she wished to leave as an inheritance the certainty that fidelity to God is worth more than any earthly good. Her death was not marked by despair or fear, but by a trusting surrender into the Lord's arms. It was the crowning of an entire life of self-gift and sacrifice. On August 24, 1617, the feast of the Apostle Saint Bartholomew, Rose of Lima, surrendered her soul to God at only 31 years of age. Her passing was mourned by the entire city, for even those who had criticized her recognized her holiness. Crowds flocked to the place of her wake, wishing to touch her clothing or to take relics as a sign of blessing. Simple people spontaneously acclaimed her sanctity, convinced that they had lost a powerful intercessor and gained a saint in heaven. Her death became a public manifestation of faith and devotion. Rose's funeral was impressive, bringing together people of all social classes, the poor, the rich, religious, civil authorities, and even foreigners living in Lima. All, without distinction, wanted to pay homage to the young woman who had marked the city with her holiness. It was the confirmation that Rose's hidden life had become a light for the entire community. Her body, so fragile and suffering, was now revered as a temple of holiness, and her memory began to be venerated as an example of love and fidelity to Christ. The death of Rose of Lima was not the end, but the beginning of a devotion that would grow rapidly. In a short time, reports of miracles began to circulate, attributed to her intercession. The sick were healed, families received graces, and many testified to extraordinary favors obtained through her prayers. The people recognized her as a saint even before the church formalized her canonization. The young woman from Lima, who had lived hidden, mortified and misunderstood, became in death a flame of faith that illuminated not only Peru, but all of the Americas. After her death, the fame of sanctity of Rose of Lima spread with impressive speed. The people who had lived with her bore witness with emotion to her life of prayer, charity, and penance. Soon, accounts of graces and miracles obtained through her intercession began to appear. Many sick people were cured upon invoking her name, and distressed people found consolation in times of anguish. This news spread not only through Lima, but also to other regions of the Viceroyalty of Peru, arousing a popular devotion that grew day by day. The testimonies were so numerous that they could not be ignored by ecclesiastical authorities. Priests, religious, and even physicians confirmed extraordinary cases that had no natural explanation. One of the most cited miracles was that of a gravely ill man who, upon touching an object belonging to Rose, immediately regained his health. Others claimed to have been protected from accidents or dangers after asking for her intercession. These signs reinforced the popular conviction that Rose was not only a pious young woman, but a saint who was already interceding with God. Devotion grew to the point that Rose was quickly considered the Patroness of Lima. Churches and chapels began to receive her images, and the faithful of all ages invoked her in their prayers. The simplicity of her life, marked by humility and service to the poor, made the people identify with her. Unlike European saints who seemed distant from Latin American reality, Rose was a young woman of the land itself, who had walked the same streets and shared the same difficulties. This made her even closer and dearer to the people's hearts. The Dominican order, of which Rose was a member as a laywoman, also played a fundamental role in the spread of her devotion. The friars recorded testimonies, preserved her writings, and encouraged veneration of her memory. Rose's life was presented as a concrete example that holiness could blossom not only in convents, but also in the world. Her fidelity and spiritual radicality were seen as the fruit of God's grace, which acts in any time and place. Thus, Rose became a sign of hope for all the Americas. The process of Rose of Lima's beatification officially began in 1630, only 13 years after her death. This short interval shows the strength of her reputation for holiness. Documents were collected, witnesses were heard, and the Church carefully analyzed the miracles attributed to her intercession. Popular devotion, already consolidated, gave even more force to the process. Meanwhile, in Lima, crowds continued to turn to the Saint of the Americas, asking for blessings and giving thanks for graces received. In 1668, Pope Clement IX declared Saint Rose of Lima blessed, officially authorizing her cult. The news was received with immense joy in Peru and throughout Spanish America, for it was the first time a daughter of the continent had received this honor. Churches filled with the faithful in solemn celebrations, and devotion to Rose spread even more rapidly. Her beatification confirmed what the people already knew: that humble young woman from Lima was truly holy before God. 3 years later, in 1671, Pope Clement X officially canonized Rose of Lima, making her the first saint of the American continent. The decree of canonization exalted her life of prayer, penance, and charity, and recognized the innumerable miracles performed through her intercession. This canonization was not only a religious event, but also a cultural and social one, for it reaffirmed the spiritual dignity of Latin America before the world. The continent, so often seen only as a colony, now offered to heaven its first universally recognized saint. Rose's canonization was celebrated with great solemnity in Rome and in Lima. In Peru, the joy was so intense that processions, solemn masses, and popular festivities were organized that lasted for days. The people acclaimed Rose as the flower of Lima and the glory of Peru. The Church's official recognition merely confirmed what was already engraved in the hearts of the faithful. Rose was not only a young saint, but the intercessor who represented an entire nation before God. Devotion to her became a central element of Peru's Catholic identity. With canonization, Saint Rose was proclaimed Patroness of Lima, of Peru, of Latin America, of the Philippines, and of the East. This geographical extension of her devotion shows the power of her spirituality, which transcended borders and cultures. Her simple and hidden life in a small house in Lima became an inspiration for millions of faithful around the world. She became a universal model of holiness, showing that love for Christ and for one's neighbor is a path accessible to all, regardless of origin or social condition. The miracles attributed to Saint Rose continued even after her canonization. Numerous testimonies reported cures, conversions, and graces obtained through her intercession. This continuity of signs showed that her mission had not ended with death, but was prolonged in heaven, alongside Christ. The people firmly believed that she heard their supplications and acted as a spiritual mother for all. This confidence further reinforced her popularity and her position as one of the most beloved saints of the Catholic Church. Devotion to Saint Rose of Lima was also marked by her connection with the poor and the suffering. Many invoked her especially in times of hardship, epidemics, and disasters, trusting in her powerful intercession. Her image spread through churches, homes, and even ships as a sign of protection and hope. For the faithful, Rose was living proof that God does not abandon his people, but chooses simple persons to manifest his grace. This closeness to the humble made her devotion even stronger and more enduring. Thus, the canonization of Saint Rose of Lima was not only the recognition of a holy life, but the beginning of a universal cult that made her a patroness and model for generations. Her life, marked by prayer, penance, and charity, became a light for the entire continent. The miracles attributed to her intercession confirmed her closeness to God, and popular devotion consolidated her position as one of the Church's most beloved saints. Rose, the humble young woman from Lima, became forever a symbol of the holiness that blossoms in the heart of the Americas. The legacy of Saint Rose of Lima goes far beyond her own time, for her life continues to inspire the faithful throughout the world to this very day. She showed that holiness is not restricted to cloisters or great pulpits, but can blossom in the silence of a simple home amid daily difficulties. Her choice to live poverty, prayer, and charity in a radical manner was a clear message that the gospel is possible in every circumstance, regardless of social or cultural condition. Rose became a model of holiness accessible to all. One of the most striking aspects of her legacy is its missionary dimension. Although she never left Lima, Rose united herself spiritually to the Church's mission throughout the world. Her prayers for missionaries, her penances offered for the conversion of peoples, and her love for the universal Church made her, in a sense, a missionary without leaving home. Today, in a globalized world, her life continues to remind us that everyone can participate in the Church's mission, whether with words and actions or with prayer and silent sacrifice. Another central point of Saint Rose's legacy is her spirituality of reparation. She understood the Christian life as continual offering, uniting sufferings and joys to Christ's sacrifice for the salvation of the world. This attitude is especially timely at a time when many flee suffering at any cost. Rose teaches that pain, when embraced with love, can become a source of redemption. Her life invites the faithful to see in suffering not merely a heavy cross, but also an opportunity for more intimate union with God. Rose's charity also continues to be a light for the Church. Her love for the poor, the sick, and the marginalized is an example that true faith is not limited to prayer, but is made concrete in gestures of compassion. In a world marked by inequalities and indifference, Saint Rose reminds us that Christ is present in the most needy. Her life challenges every Christian to look around and perceive that there is always someone waiting for a gesture of love, however small it may be. This lesson makes her holiness extremely current and necessary. Devotion to Saint Rose of Lima also reinforces the importance of persevering prayer. She spent hours before the Blessed Sacrament, finding strength to face all her trials. Today, amid the agitation of modern life, many Christians find it difficult to pray consistently. Rose teaches that prayer is the source of all balance and the key to union with God. Her example shows that there is no holiness without intimate dialogue with the Lord, whether in great temples or in the silence of a humble room. Rose's example is especially significant for women. At a time when the female role was often limited, she demonstrated extraordinary strength, facing social and family pressures to follow her vocation. Her life reveals that feminine holiness is capable of transforming entire societies, radiating light even without occupying positions of power. Today, Saint Rose continues to be an inspiration for women around the world who seek to live their faith with authenticity, courage, and dedication to God and family. The title of Patroness of Latin America and the Philippines, granted to Saint Rose, reinforces the universality of her message. She became a symbol of Christ's presence on the newly evangelized continent and a witness that holiness is not the monopoly of one people or culture. Her canonization showed the world that the Americas had their own spiritual voice, capable of offering saints of universal greatness. This recognition strengthened Latin America's Catholic identity and gave hope to peoples who were still consolidating their faith. Today, Saint Rose continues to be invoked in moments of crisis, illness, and difficulty. Many of the faithful turn to her for protection and intercession, and her devotion remains alive in various countries. Feasts, processions, and celebrations in her honor are held annually, especially on August 23rd, when the Church celebrates her liturgical memorial. These manifestations of popular faith show that her example did not remain in the past, but continues to nourish the hope of millions of people around the world. Saint Rose is also an example for youth. She shows that it is possible to be young and live a life of radical holiness without giving in to the world's pressures. Her decision to consecrate herself to Christ from an early age is an inspiration for all those who seek to live purity, prayer, and charity amid the temptations of modernity. At a time when so many young people feel lost, Rose presents herself as a sure guide, reminding them that true happiness is in God and not in the empty promises of a consumer society. The life of Saint Rose of Lima is also a testimony to the power of humility. She never sought recognition, honors, or human glory. On the contrary, she wished to be forgotten by the world and remembered only by God. This attitude stands in great contrast to the current mentality, marked by an incessant search for visibility and fame. Rose reminds us that true greatness lies in living hidden in the heart of Christ, doing everything with love and simplicity. Her humility continues to be an invitation to Christian authenticity. Saint Rose's example also teaches us that holiness does not require deeds that are extraordinary in human eyes, but fidelity in everyday life. Her path was marked by simple prayers, humble work, care for the poor, and silent offerings to God. This shows that all of us can follow the same path, transforming our daily tasks into acts of love. Holiness, as she demonstrates, is not a privilege of a few, but a universal call for all the baptized. This message is one of the most beautiful of her legacy. Finally, the legacy of Saint Rose of Lima is a call to hope. Her life proves that even amid difficulties, illnesses, criticisms, and poverty, it is possible to blossom in holiness. She is the rose that sprouted from the arid soil of the contradictions of colonial Lima, but that spread its perfume throughout the entire world. Today, her spiritual presence continues to strengthen the Church and inspire the faithful to live with more love, more prayer, and more trust in God. Saint Rose of Lima remains a beacon of light in the heart of the Americas and a living testimony that holiness is the destiny to which we are all called.